Good afternoon from Singapore, and welcome to today's virtual discussion hosted by the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. My name is Clemens Che, a research fellow at the Institute, and I will be moderating today's proceedings on Jordan, encompassing both its domestic politics and its geopolitical situation. Joining us today are two guest speakers, Dr. Steve Monroe and Dr. Nikolai Dew Gunderson, who are both experts on the subject matter and have also recently published books related to the Middle East and also delving into Jordan's politics. I will shortly be introducing their profiles. Steve and Nikolai, good to have you with us. Before we begin, let me quickly run through the sequence of today's proceedings. We will start with opening remarks from both our guest speakers, about 10 minutes each, before we open up the discussion to the audience for questions. So if you have any burning questions later, you are invited to key them into the Zoom chat box. Now, allow me to introduce our guest speakers. Dr. Steve Monroe is an assistant professor of political science at Yale NUS College at the National University of Singapore. He's a scholar of development with a focus on the Arab world, and his scholarship examines two of the region's most pressing developmental challenges, including limited economic integration and gender inequality. Steve's book, Mirages of Reform, is just hot off the press, and it examines the politics of elite protectionism in the Arab world. And there is a discount code for his book, which we will key into the Zoom chat box later on. Steve, great to have you with us. Also joining us is Dr. Nikolai Dew Gunderson, who is an independent researcher on the Middle East. He was formerly with the United Nations, and he is the author of Defending Dictatorship, published with Palgrave Macmillan, and The Privatization of Warfare, published with Lancia Intersentia. He has worked in Jordan as a political analyst and is a media commentator for Al Jazeera and CGTN America. Nikolai, thanks for joining us too. Now, let us proceed with today's topic, which is Jordan's Balancing Act, seeking stability amid regional turmoil. Some of the latest updates on Jordan related to both the geopolitical and domestic fronts include Jordanian King Abdullah II's rejection of US President Donald Trump's proposal for his country to absorb Palestinians living in Gaza, part of that now infamous Riviera plan that was previously produced by the Trump administration. When dealing with the Trump administration also, the Jordanian king is certainly caught in a bind between rejecting Palestinian displacement and restoring the flow of foreign assistance from Washington. Amman has certainly long-standing identity issues arising from citizens of Palestinian origins, which can be traced back to the aftermath of the 1948 war. Domestically, there's also been news. Most recently, we have Jordan's parliamentary elections held last September, which produced a strong Islamist showing with the Islamic Action Front, the IAF, that's also the political arm of the Muslim Brotherhood, emerging. More recently, just last month, the Muslim Brotherhood was banned over attack plots. So let us now begin today's discussion on the latter topic, which is domestic politics, and that crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood, including issues of political representation in Jordan. So let me now hand it over to Nikolai, who will give his opening remarks. Nikolai, please.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Allow me just to share my screen, and I have a presentation ready to sort of talk about Jordan as kind of an overview for us. Indeed, Jordan as a country, or the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, is a country that's always been geostrategically located. I think that's important to remember. If we see, for example, just from this map, we see Jordan borders Saudi Arabia, which is one of the major Gulf allies it has that provides aid to it because Jordan is resource dry. It borders Syria, Iraq, Israel, the occupied territories. When the king was asked, he actually had an appearance on the Jon Stewart show. When he was asked by the host, where is Jordan located? He replied, between Iraq and a hard place. And although it was quite funny, the point he was making is that Jordan is located in a very tough part of the world. It has finite resources and is often reliant on aid and has seen a lot of conflict as well. So understanding Jordan's security is also important because from the beginning, when Transjordan was founded, going back to sort of the 20s, Abdullah I, he brought the country together by networking with key tribes. And the idea was that the tribes would protect the monarchy, they would serve in the British-trained Arab Legion and form the backbone of the Arab army. And so, really, from the first day of Jordan, we saw loyalties based on serving the monarchy, protecting its honor and its dignity, and this sort of centralization of tribes. And we see that even up to the present. And it is an issue when it comes to Jordanians of Palestinian origin that we will discuss in a bit more detail throughout this talk, I think. So when it comes to, as comes mentioned, looking at from 1948 and also 1967, when you had Palestinians who came into Jordan during two conflicts as Israel was established, we see a situation in which under King Hussein, who ruled up until 1999, roughly from the 50s to 1999, he granted Palestinians citizenship, but he couldn't get their land back. And he also did not provide the same kind of status for citizens of Jordan who came from the West Bank as those who are from the Bedouin tribes. So, for example, we see here Sakisha, this is a jeweler's in Jordan, one of the largest brands in the kingdom, run by a Palestinian family. And so what we found is that in Jordan, there is political segregation. And what happened was that Palestinians were actually in government for a while. However, in the 70s, there was an assassination attempt on King Hussein by a Palestinian-linked organization. And after that, Palestinians were purged from the public sector. So we found that many of them, they turned to the private sector where they run businesses quite successful, I might add, and they don't have the same kind of status or assets that the tribes have. So most of the tribes or the Bedouins are in the public sector and are able to get certain jobs in government through connections and whatnot. So the issue of citizenship, I think, is an important one because it's not necessarily you're Jordanian and that's it. It's more a case of, well, are you from the East Bank or the West Bank? So we already see before we had the so-called war in Gaza, this kind of divide in the kingdom between those who have Palestinian roots and those who are from the tribes. Let's not forget that Jordan was one of the few Arab states up until the Abraham Accords to sign a peace treaty with Israel. This is in 1994. King Hussein signed them, and they were negotiated secretly through meetings at his actually doctor's house in London with Israeli officials. Now, one of the things to mention is that other than Jordan, the other country that signed with Israel a peace treaty was Egypt, and Anwar Sadat, the president who signed, was assassinated by someone linked to the Muslim Brotherhood, which of course is relevant to Jordan as well. For Jordan itself, it was hoped that the signing of this treaty would mean better access to Washington, more access to aid, and also that Israel would lobby for aid for Jordan on Jordan's behalf. Now, it's interesting also when you look at the Abraham Accords, because one of the things that I discussed in one of my publications was when the Abraham Accords were starting to be signed, what is Jordan's role? If Jordan no longer needs to be a mediator between Israel and other Arab states, would that diminish its aid, for example, and its importance in the region to Washington? So Abdullah II, the current king who began ruling in 1999 as well, he was, I think, 36 years old. And it's interesting to bear in mind that before the Arab Spring, in the early 2000s, there were a couple of rulers who took over their fathers, including in Syria, who were in their 30s. They were seen as young. They were seen as potential reformers at the time, and so Abdullah II inherited a Jordan that has relations with Israel, although this is something that has again been challenged by the war in Gaza, but also one where tribalism remains the norm, and that kind of power structure remains the norm. Now, in a 2013 interview, the king said publicly, when my son takes over, the system we have should be stabilized. It will be a Western democracy with a constitutional monarchy. Now, I'm not sure if that's happening now. I would argue that given what's been happening in Palestine and also the shutting down of the Muslim Brotherhood, we're actually seeing perhaps an increase in censorship to an extent. We're seeing a shift towards stability as opposed to trying to emulate Western democracy. So again, as I mentioned before, there is ongoing reliance on a tribal power base. And there's also a focus on the so-called ruling bargain that the monarchy rules in exchange for providing benefits. But also, as Clemens mentioned, the idea of religion is important. So this is a family, the royal family, they descend from the Prophet Muhammad himself. And so the king, again, in the same interview, he talked about that and said, you know, it gives you a sense of calm. There is a sense of responsibility, but you feel very assured of yourself. Now, that religious legitimacy is also something that came out during protests where he argued, you know, indirectly, you cannot go against a pious ruler, you cannot go against the descendant of the Prophet because to do so would be un-Islamic. At the same time, Queen Rania of Jordan is Palestinian. So Queen Rania is a Palestinian who I believe was brought up in Kuwait. And when protests began to happen, there were members of certain tribes who said, look, you know, she's building her own power base. She's going beyond the role of First Lady. And this is not what we agreed on between the Hashemite monarchy and the tribes that will keep them in power. Of course, the Arab Spring, as you know, we've all heard about it, and this is important to look at within the context of there's two things about the Arab Spring in general. So either economic or political factors, and usually it's both. So of course, in 2011, we saw protests over corruption and unemployment, but at the same time, we've also seen how the Arab Spring, did it ever really stop in some countries? You know, that's one. Secondly, how did it become politicized? So the Muslim Brotherhood, around this time, we saw the Muslim Brotherhood observing with interest what was happening in Jordan. And the king, again, in the same interview with The Atlantic in 2013, he said, look, basically, I don't trust the Muslim Brotherhood. He said this quite publicly, where he said, they came to me during the protest and said, we supported you, we supported your father. And he replied to them, this is completely untrue. I know that you are viewing what's happened in Tunisia, you're viewing what's happening in Egypt. And he said in the interview, I believe they thought their time had come, that they thought the monarchy was going to fall during this time. And I mention this because I think that feeds into more recent developments regarding what happened in Jordan just a few weeks ago regarding the shutting down of the Muslim Brotherhood offices. Perhaps things went too far. And we saw in the 2013 elections, not a very high turnout, but again, it was mainly about keeping the status quo, those tribal lines, empowering royalists. And this is also why the Muslim Brotherhood may have been seen as a threat. We've seen in different countries, governments that have allowed the Muslim Brotherhood to operate have done so on the assumption that it lets people blow some steam. It's about, you know, getting a bit political and the Muslim Brotherhood filling some welfare gaps. In the September 2025 elections, when the Islamic Action Front gained quite well, I think that it disturbed some royalists. It made the monarchy rethink the role of the Muslim Brotherhood and say, okay, well, we don't want them to go too far. We also saw here the unrest in 2018. So let's not forget that before we had the so-called war in Gaza, we did have Trump announcing during his first term that Jerusalem was going to be where we had the US embassy for Israel, basically saying Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. And some of my colleagues in Jordan, they were fiercely against this. Many Jordanians and Palestinians were against this. This is a photo taken by a friend of mine in Jordan when they were protesting, saying Palestine is our right. And we can see here the mix between protesting for socioeconomics and politics. So on the one hand, we had these protests that police responded to very, very carefully. But also around this time in 2018, later, we had a tax bill that was going to be introduced, and people protested against that to the point that it was withdrawn to be amended. And we see this happening time and again, that there are periods when the Jordanian government wants to lift subsidies or end certain things or increase taxes, and there's a huge protest because people feel that they're not able to have a good life. We also see Jordanians complaining that they're being pushed out of the middle class. So Jordan, you know, we have a country here that has a lot to balance. It requires aid. It has a majority Palestinian populace. There are issues of geopolitics, of course, and then there's the issue of perhaps not allowing as generous a life as you would see in the Gulf states as well. So briefly, just talking about succession, I think it's interesting to look at Crown Prince Hussein, pictured at the top here. So he is half Palestinian. Now this is important because the idea that the monarchy, the country could have a half Palestinian king in the soon future, I think is very real. I'm curious what the tribes think of that. And it may also feed into the 2021 supposed coup attempt that we saw. This is the first time we've seen such a highly publicized feud between the king and his half-brother Hamzah, who's pictured bottom left. Now, one of the things I'll mention, about Hamza is that he looks very much like King Hussein, and that is intentional. He has the same kind of mustache. He has learned how to speak the dialect of the Bedouin tribes as well, and to try to speak their language. If you listen to King Abdullah of Jordan speak Arabic, I myself, I speak Arabic, and I do feel that when you listen to him speak it, it doesn't sound as natural as the Bedouin dialect, because he grew up, part of his childhood was in the UK. He's half English. Hamza is half American, by the way. But this idea that Hamza could take over wasn't necessarily untrue. It seems that there were certain figures who were encouraging him to do so, saying that you should be like your father. And so what happened in 2021 was that he started to have contact with key tribes. And on top of that, he began to, some would argue, upstage the king at certain events. During COVID, for example, when the king was going to visit a hospital in Salt, which is the former capital, he turned up first wearing his father's tie to console parents and family of loved ones who died of COVID. That's supposed to be what the king does. So when that happened, I think a red line was crossed and he was then placed under house arrest. So we see here the way that Jordan is changing. The treaty with Israel is somewhat under threat, and we're also seeing the Abraham Accords that may have been kind of paused a little bit with the war in Gaza. We also see a Jordan that is turning to the Gulf a little bit more than it used to, and also the issue of managing Trump. So I think maybe this will come up in the Q&A, but going back to, so Abdullah rejecting Trump's Riviera plan, this is true, but in the press conference at the White House, one of the things that I noticed Abdullah did was that he announced with Trump, he said, one of the things we can do right now is we can accept 2,000 Palestinian children from Gaza who require treatment. And of course, that implies accepting their families as well. Now, Trump seemed to act genuinely surprised, because he then said, I didn't know you were going to do that. That's a beautiful gesture. And I think that that was the king's way of trying to manage Trump, that you reject the Riviera plan, but you compromise on something else. I do believe that this is one of the key issues for the monarchy and for Abdullah himself. How do you manage Trump if he is seen as more pro-Israel, more aggressive than previous presidents? I think this is something which we will see him coming back to. But we also see a Jordan in which some of the tribes are saying, like the Bani Sakli tribe are saying, why should we respect the monarchy if we're not getting anything out of it? And we've seen more recently, before the closure of the Muslim Brotherhood, we start to see things like, for example, more censorship online. There was a cybercrime law that I wrote about, I think 2 years ago, where the law itself criminalizes further defamation to the country or writing anything that is sort of, sensitive to the country's national security. It's very broadly and vaguely defined. So I think we're starting to see a Jordan that is a bit less free, and where there's more focus on stability for the monarchy during a tough period, as opposed to turning to democracy. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nikolai, for giving us a really great overview of the domestic politics, the ruling bargain. Certainly, we will come back to that, and as well as the religious legitimacy part, which I think we will also return to later on. And also, I think your great insights on the geopolitical situation that is faced by King Abdullah II. We'll all attempt to deal with that and address that in the Q&A later on. But let me now turn to Steve. Steve, I think you two have a presentation, and Steve, your book, which has a central argument saying that Jordan does, and I quote, Jordan does have a strategy of extensive but deceptive reform. And I think you speak on this, or you wrote on this from the angle of trade policies, especially in Jordan. So I think you will also be able to expand on what Nikolai has also covered, which is the real political situation in Jordan, and you can touch on some of these economic issues, which are all connected. So over to you, Steve.
All right. So to build upon Nikolai's excellent presentation, and to continue our discussion of how Jordan is managed under the second Trump administration, I think for all of us, but especially for the Jordanian government, the first 100 days of the Trump administration has been eventful, to put it mildly. There have been 3 policy announcements with huge socioeconomic ramifications for Jordan. The first, as was brought up earlier, was the Trump administration's claim to "quote unquote" own Gaza and displace millions of Gazans either into Jordan or Egypt. A second policy move with huge implications for the Jordanian economy was the Trump administration's decision to shutter USAID. And last but not least, in April, the Trump administration proposed raising tariffs. And I'll talk about how these tariffs might affect the Jordanian economy. And so, in the wake of these huge geopolitical headwinds, many experts and analysts warned about the region, specifically Egypt and Jordan, facing this worst case scenario of both cutting aid as well as cutting trade for these states. So in light of today's conversation, I'm trying to answer, how has the Jordanian government navigated these first 100 days of the second Trump administration? The honest and less interesting answer, possibly more truthful answer, is that it's hard to tell. The headlines keep shifting and changing every day. This is a hallmark of the Trump administration. But if I were to provide a more enlightened and possibly interesting answer, I'd say that the Jordanian government has largely been successful in managing the Trump administration in these first 100 days. So why? So for each of these critical issue areas, we see, at least for now, pauses within the within the Trump administration. And I'll talk about this shortly, but Trump's Gaza plan has been put under the rug for now. Aid cuts to Jordan have been spared, at least for now, and the impact of tariffs on the Jordanian economy, if these tariffs are in fact lifted, which is still a question mark, are still unclear. In today's presentation, I'll talk first about how aid looks like in Jordan. Then we'll discuss how Jordan's trade profile looks at. And then the third part of today's presentation, I'm going to circle back to the question of this presentation, is how is the Jordanian government managing under Trump 2.0? So to begin with aid, Jordan is a major U.S. aid recipient. Last year was the third largest U.S. foreign aid recipient after Ukraine and Israel. About 3/4 of that aid goes to economic assistance, specifically in terms of government spending, and 1/4 goes to the military, according to the U.S. News. Under the Biden administration in 2022, right before the Gaza war, the U.S. government pledged to extend or to provide over close to $1.5 billion in annual U.S. aid to the kingdom over the next 7 years. And a big concern when Trump announced halting U.S. aid was that this money would be cut. As I'll talk about later in the presentation, the more recent news is that this will, at least for the next fiscal year, this funding will continue. So why is Jordan such a major recipient of U.S. aid? As mentioned in Nikolai's presentation, the origins of Jordan's developmental assistance from the United States comes from its peace treaty with Israel in 1994. This was a huge issue for the Clinton administration at the time. As Nikolai brought up, Jordan was the second Arab state to recognize the state of Israel. Over time, Jordan's geopolitical value to the United States has increased. It's moved beyond strictly recognizing Israel. Jordan was a vital partner to the United States in the war on terror. Under King Abdullah II, the United States could fly over and use military bases when it invaded Iraq in 2003. And then with the war on terror and the war against ISIS, Jordan's intelligence and United States intelligence have worked really closely to counter extremism and terrorism in the region. This is a photo from King Abdullah's, I think his Instagram account 10 years ago after a Jordanian pilot was burned to death by ISIS, showing King Abdullah kind of his military response to this terrorist act. Because of Jordan's close geopolitical alignments with the United States and because of its large dependence or the large amount of foreign aid it receives from Jordan, Trump's tariff cuts would be a huge blow to the Jordanian economy. Recently, a former Jordanian planning minister told the Times of Israel that eliminating the support would significantly worsen the Jordanian government's deficit and debt burden. Today, we face a deficit, he said. Losing close to $800 million would be devastating for the Jordanian economy. So that's how that's how aid and aid politics looks in Jordan. Switching to trade, Jordan was one of the few or handful of Arab states that was on Trump's reciprocal tariff list. So just to step back, On Trump's Tariff Liberation Day, his first policy was to issue a blanket 10% tariff on all foreign goods or all foreign exports entering the United States. He then had a separate list, a reciprocal tariff list, with higher tariff rates. And lo and behold, Jordan was on that list. And under Trump's reciprocal tariff plan, Jordanian exports to the United States would be issued a 20% tariff hike. The reason Jordan was on this list is because Jordan has a trade surplus to the United States. In 2024, the value of Jordan exports to the United States was over $3 billion, which was more than the value of US exports to Jordan. And the Trump's tariff calculus is very much focused on the US's trade deficits. And the ethos behind the Trump administration is to reduce the US's trade dependency or trade deficits with foreign states. Now, Jordan has high export exposure to the United States. So while Jordanian exports to the US make up less than 1% of all US exports, Jordan exports to the United States as a share of Jordanian exports is 25% of all Jordanian exports, right? So if we look at all of Jordanian exports in terms of value, about a quarter of it is shipped off to the United States. So this rate as a share is comparable to levels in Vietnam and Cambodia, right? So these are countries with high exposure to exporting their products to US markets. So while on a relative term, this is very high, in absolute terms, Jordan's export exposure to the United States is quite small. Trade makes up a much smaller percent of the Jordanian economy than trade does in places like Vietnam or Cambodia. So Cambodia has a similar population as Jordan, but the value of its exports to the United States is 3 times higher. And so one could infer that the impact of Trump's tariffs will be much harsher on the Cambodian economy than it would on the Jordanian economy. Here's another graph taken from UN's Environment and Social Communities. What does that stand for? Commission for West Asia, which shows Jordan's export exposure to the US relative to the other Arab states. And Jordan, again, is an outlier, right? So relative to places like Lebanon, Egypt, or Bahrain, their non-oil exports is a much smaller percent of the total direct exports in Jordan. The reason for this can be traced to trade policy. Jordan was the 4th country to sign a free trade agreement with the United States. So this is King Abdullah signing a free trade agreement with Bill Clinton in 2000. So Jordan was the 4th country to have an FTA with the United States. It was the first Arab country to have a free trade agreement with the United States. Jordan also has a free trade agreement with Singapore, by the way. In 2005, Jordan signed this agreement. And this has been a hallmark of King Abdullah II's economic policy. And so as my book discusses, at least on paper, the Jordanian economic statecraft has been very much geared towards greater trade integration. And because of this trade integration, in particular because of Jordan's free trade agreement with the United States, certain sectors in Jordan have been able to thrive over the last 20 years. In particular, Jordan's garment industry has done quite well because of the United States free trade agreement. So last year, Jordan's garment industry exported roughly $2 billion worth of exports to the United States economy. So that's 80% roughly of Jordanian exports to the United States come from its garment industry. This is because of the free trade agreement. So because of Jordan's FTA, free trade agreement with the United States, garments produced in Jordan have a much lower tariff or tax on import than garments produced in places like Vietnam or Cambodia. Economists call this tariff diversion. So if we were to think about comparative advantage and why some countries can export goods and not others, Jordan does not have an advantage in terms of energy costs. So energy is quite expensive in Jordan, nor does it have an advantage in terms of labor costs. Jordanian, so local labor in Jordan is actually quite expensive. One thing that's controversial about Jordan's garment industry is that it employs a lot of foreigners, or it imports foreigners to work in this garment sector. But because of Jordan's free trade agreement with the United States, shirts made in Jordan are still relatively cheaper than shirts made in places like Vietnam or Bangladesh. And so a big fear with these high tariffs is that Jordan would lose its comparative advantage because its exports will now be more expensive than places from Bangladesh. When I was doing field work in Jordan in 2016, this was right after Trump's first election, and the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was promoted by Obama and which would have promoted trade between the Pacific and the United States, the Trump administration canceled that. Jordanian garment exporters were thrilled because they were very worried that if the TPP were passed, they would lose their business to Vietnamese, specifically Vietnamese exporters, right? So a narrative behind these new tariff raises is that because of Jordan's high export exposure to the United States, it risks suffering a huge economic hit. So how has Jordan fared under Trump 2.0? I have to repeat that it's hard to tell. Politics are shifting quickly. But I'll make the case that, at least for now, it's been quite successful. And so going back to these three policies that Trump has proposed in his first 100 days, if we look at the Gaza plan, when that was first announced, certainly people who know Jordanian politics much more than I do, their read on it was that the Trump administration had had put the Jordanian regime under the bus, that the Trump administration didn't care about Jordan. And as brought up by Nikolai's presentation, King Abdullah then met him quickly after the announcement. And for all things, especially relative to Trump's other meetings with heads officials like Zelensky, the king managed his meeting with Trump quite well. There were no high-profile, explosive interactions. And in fact, shortly after the United States pledged to walk back on its Gaza comments, and we haven't heard much about the Trump administration's desire to turn Gaza into a Riviera. For the moment, who knows? Things could happen in a week. Now, in terms of aid cuts, last month, the Prime Minister of Jordan, Hassan, visited DC, and shortly thereafter, there became the announcement that Jordan would be spared major major aid cuts for now. So specifically in terms of debt refinancing, all that will still be continued for the short time being. So there's been nothing splashy about Jordanian diplomacy with the Trump administration, but at least, and again, I have to stress this is tentative, it seems to be working, that a lot of Trump administration's priorities have been carved out or made have excluded Jordan for the Jordanian government's interests. And lastly, with regards to tariffs, again, the situation is changing quickly. Just over the weekend, there might not even be a tariff or a trade war if the Trump administration is able to have its deal with China. But assuming that there is this trade war and that after the 90-day Trump tariff pause, tariffs are raised on most of the global economy, many worry that this would be detrimental for Jordan. The primary worry is that with weaker European and Asian markets as a result of the Trump trade war, it'd be harder for these Jordanian economies to manage. It might also raise borrowing costs as a result to a slower growing global economy. And then the fear is that there's going to be greater competition in non-tariff markets as exports from Asia move out of the United States and into the Middle East or Europe. Others, however, see opportunity for Jordan in this world with higher tariffs. So this is a graph by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. On the y-axis, you see their estimate tariff raises because of the Trump tariffs across different regions. What this graph shows is that while Europe and Asia are going to confront higher Trump tariffs on average, the Middle East is relatively spared from that. And so even though Jordan would face higher tariffs, relative to competitors or export competitors in the Pacific and in Europe, some optimists would argue that this would make Jordanian exports relatively cheaper, to be determined. Now, in terms of what a trade war would mean in terms of US negotiations with Jordan, over the past 5 years or so, there have been a few trade sticking points between the United States and Jordan. The United States has pushed the Jordanian government to loosen its import licensing requirements for agricultural goods like chicken and to have clearer standards for its imports of corn. Over the last 2 decades, the United States has always pressed the Jordanian government to be much more transparent over government procurement and to allow American companies to compete with that. And then a kind of perennial issue and question is whether or not the Trump administration would link questions of Middle East peace and a deal with Israel with regards to trade. So this is a 180, a reversion over earlier US trade policy where access to US markets, like having a free trade agreement, was a reward for Jordan in exchange for recognizing Israel. Now we might see this flip where a return of access to US markets in exchange for compromises with regards to the Trump administration's Middle East plan. Scholars and analysts are very skeptical of the strategy, as recently noted by former Jordanian Foreign Minister Marwan Morasher, and as highlighted in Nikolai's presentation, because of the questions of Gaza and Palestine are existential to Jordanian politics. It's unlikely that Trump could use trade or even aid to try to move the Hashemite regime in terms of making compromises over red lines on the Israel and Gaza issue. So that's an overview of my presentation. If you find this interesting, I do have to plug my book, which is about the politics of trade liberalization in the Arab world and in Jordan. If you're interested and if you would like a discount code, please email me. My book is coming out on Friday. If you disagree with me, I'd also love to hear with you as well. And thank you again for the opportunity to share my thoughts on Jordanian politics with you all.
Thank you, Steve. Another great presentation and building on Nikolai's earlier remarks. We will now kick off the Q&A session. And I'd like to invite our participants and audience to key in your questions, if you have any, into the chat box. But first, let me exercise my privilege as moderator to ask both our guest speakers different questions, based on what they have shared earlier. The first will be to Nikolai, and I also draw reference to your book, Defending Dictatorship. And in your book, you also mentioned you use this term defensive democratization. And earlier in your own remarks, you said that we are likely to see a focus on stability, and that is why we are seeing some censorship in Jordan. Can you expand a bit on this defensive democratization that is being used by the Jordanian regime? So let's start with that, and then I have another question for.
Certainly, thank you. So regarding defensive democratization, this is a term I use in my book to discuss how the government manages, should we say, the risk of unrest, especially with some of its key patrons. So, for example, if the government wants to raise taxes or cut down on privileges, they are indirectly attacking their own base of support if we're talking about a system where the tribes support the monarchy. So what they would do is, under certain circumstances, they would address this socioeconomic reduction by allowing for more political openness to a point. For example, elections, allowing for people to have more votes. There was a period under King Hussein when, for example, parties were banned entirely because it was seen as there would be a challenge to the monarchy. So defensive democratization is, if you like, the image of democratization and opening up some political space during periods of economic challenge when the regime feels forced to levy taxes or engage in other practices just to get money, and by doing so, it affects their base of support. I think what we're also seeing regarding the Muslim Brotherhood and whether or not there's going to be a reduction of political freedom, if we assume here that firstly the Islamic Action Front and the Muslim Brotherhood were seen as just ways to blow steam, for the public to blow steam, if that was meant to be their main role, they are not meant to challenge the status quo. And this is a problem because we saw that in other countries, like in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood was very good at filling welfare gaps, which, frank with you, made the government sometimes look bad. If there was a natural disaster and the Muslim Brotherhood got there first, they started to hand out blankets, provide aid. This was an issue. And in many of these events, what they would do is Muslim Brotherhood provide welfare of some sort, but they would also promote their version of Islam and say Islam is the solution. So they got political. I think in Jordan, again, going back to the latest elections, we saw that the percentage that the Islamic Action Front got and the activities of the Muslim Brotherhood began to worry royalists and make them say, well, we don't want to risk that they start to control the narrative, especially over Palestine. I think recently the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamic Action Front have done quite well in terms of their position on Palestine. And that topic is one that the monarchy wishes to control. The narrative is one they wish to control, as it's quite a sensitive one. And given what's happening with the war in Gaza, I think that they felt that perhaps there was a risk the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamic Action Front would begin to overtake their narrative and that they would possibly lose control.
Thanks, Nikolai. And I think the link between what is being done at home and the link with what is being done on the geopolitical front is quite an enlightening point. And I want to tie that in with my question for Steve, which is on the geopolitical value to the US that you talked about earlier. And in your book, you also mentioned that geopolitical value of Jordan increased under King Abdullah. And I wanted to ask you, how does this affect the ruling bargain at home or the connections at home? So over to you, Steve.
Yes. So in contrast to King Abdullah's father, King Hussein, which at the start of the 90s, relations between the United States and Jordan were quite tense because Jordan remained neutral during the first Gulf War when Iraq invaded Kuwait. King Hussein, in the few years before he died, righted the ship, in a sense, by signing a peace treaty with Israel. So that kind of corrected or improved relations. But a lot of this improvement grew dramatically under King Abdullah II with the War on Terror. As tensions between Palestine and Israel increased, having an ally, a stable ally like Jordan to try to mediate these relations became pivotal for the United States. And then with the Arab Spring and crisis in Syria, Jordan is often known as kind of like the center or an ally that the United States could not lose. And to his credit, King Abdullah II has been very good at cultivating and kind of promoting and strengthening relations between the United States and King Abdullah, as highlighted by this Atlantic article, but also very much in King Abdullah II's policies, economic policies as well. Those were very much aligned with what U.S. policymakers believed or wanted and what they thought would be good for Jordan. So how does this affect the ruling bargain? Well, by having so much support from the United States, and if that's translated in both military as well as developmental assistance, that could slow the costs of reform. There's also been coordination or cooperation in security affairs. So with regards to the attempted coup, I've heard that it was in fact the Biden administration that tipped off the Jordanians about this rumblings of this coup, and that in fact the Trump administration knew about it and didn't say anything about it. So this security alliances, but also this economic support can help prop the Jordanian regime. It's not the only thing that explains why the Jordanian regime is still in power, but it certainly helps or at least facilitates these arrangements. And with regards to economic liberalization, I argue that having tremendous U.S. support, on the one hand, actually does a disservice for economic reform, because in many cases, industries can skirt or not actually implement economic reform on paper, and they can get away with it because Jordan is such a critical ally to the United States, that U.S. trade policymakers have in fact been much harsher with regards to trade policy and trade standards to non-allies in the region, right? So while the United States was a huge supporter for Jordan's entrance into the World Trade Organization, throughout the 2000s, the United States blocked Syria's efforts to join the WTO.
Thank you, Steve, for that comprehensive answer. We do have questions flowing in, but first, I think we had a request from the Jordanian ambassador to Singapore to ask a question to our speakers. And I think he would like to turn on his camera and also unmute himself to ask. Please, Ambassador Samer.
Thank you, Dr. Gentleman. Thank you so much, Dr. Clemens, on this very provocative and enlightening presentations from both Professor Monroe and Nikolai. For me, as an ambassador in Singapore, I see a lot of concentration on the Gulf area, of course, on Gaza, on Syria, where the action is, but seldomly on Jordan. And for us, that's a breath of fresh air in that respect. But just a few technical questions to our in the slide where Professor Monroe put up, it said 1.7 trillion, and it's actually 1.7 billion. We don't want to be taking 10% of the GDP of the United States, Steve. So I'd like to correct that. With your kind permission, also Nikolai mentioned 70% of Jordan's population is of Palestinian are Palestinians. So I'm not sure where are you getting that from, Nikolai. From the best of my knowledge, there are 2.5 million Palestinian refugees in Jordan, and that is documented by UNRWA, the United Nations Works Agency in the Middle East. And I would like just to point out to the historical narrative where Jordan is this mosaic that had absorbed Syrian refugees during the First World War, between the First World War and Second World War. I don't want to be a history buff here, but after the Jericho Conference in 1950, following the 1948 war and the Arab Legion's defense of the West Bank and keeping of East Jerusalem successfully, we had a conference, a democratic conference in Jericho. It was where we had an amalgamation between both West Bank and East Bank. So I'm not sure where that dichotomy came, because after that, as a result of the Jericho Conference, those folks coming from the West Bank that settled in Jordan as a result of the 1948 war became Jordanian, subsequently Jordanian citizens in every sense of the word. And my mom is one of those. So in any public opinion polling, including that done by the Strategic Studies Institute, it's an independent agency, including by IRI, the International Republican Institute, etc. You would find the question of that construction answered quite well through consistent opinion polling, and you know, this is why I kind of take note that when you say 70% are Palestinian, you say Jordanian from Palestinian origin, that would be a more acceptable term. But to say 70% is Palestinian, you would be quite falling in the Ben Gavirs and the Smotriches of this world, who are arguing that Jordan is the alternative state and the alternative homeland for Palestine. So thank you very much, gentlemen, for this a very great presentation. Also, when it comes to Jordan navigating the Trump 2.0. I would like to have perhaps a second session where we could discuss economic reforms and Steve's book, which actually I would love to do. You know, particularly that Jordan has been at the forefront in terms of political reform, where the Islamic Action Front has 31 seats, where you could see them in jail in other countries around the region, while they have members of parliament in Jordan. But there's a fine line, gentlemen, as Dr. Mosher, you pointed to Dr. Mosher's paper, Vice President of Carnegie, and my former boss, the Foreign Minister of Jordan, who quite said in his recent article, there should be one monopoly on the use of force in any state. And that, Nikolai, goes to your point. When you call it Black September, you cannot have a state within a state. You can have only one state, which is the Jordanian state carrying arms, and that applies only to the armed forces in that respect. And when the Muslim Brotherhood, I give you an example. When they went back, when you go back to the 18th of October, following the Dead Sea incursion from the south border of the Dead Sea into Israel, the Muslim Brotherhood was quick to adopt the to adopt this infiltration This is where we draw the line. There was, and then there's a subsequent retraction of that statement, and then after that, the uncovering of the cell in Jordan and the ongoing trial of a cell associated with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is, by the way, a separate entity from the Islamic Action Front, which still maintains parliamentary seats, and that has not been affected by the clampdown on the Muslim Brotherhood itself, because as I said, gentlemen, there can only be one state authority that monopolizes the use of force, and this is what kept our stability in such a turmoiled region throughout. And I would like to thank you again, gentlemen, for your presentation, and forgive me for my long intervention.
So thank you for joining us as well today. We will now turn to the questions that I am looking at on the Zoom chat and also in the Q&A box. I think some of them have appeared on both sides. The first one being on assimilation in Jordan. And this question pertains to from Atticus Ting, and his question is whether the assimilation of Palestinians into Jordanian population would explain a rise in the popularity of the Muslim Brotherhood. And I'll allow, I think both of our speakers will be able to comment on this. Nikolai, perhaps you could start first.
Thank you very much. Well, I mean, regarding that, I think there's a couple of points I want to raise, which is, so firstly, I think being a Jordanian citizen, certainly I think a few years ago, there was a campaign called Kulna al-Urdun, which means all of us are Jordan. And this campaign was meant to emphasize that, citizens of Palestinian origin are still meant to be Jordanian, and they are a part of that landscape. And I think that also this is important because the Jordan as Palestine argument is rejected by a variety of actors. So Palestinians, because it would affect their right of return, but of course also Jordan itself. Now, in terms of popularity for the Muslim Brotherhood, I think that the Muslim Brotherhood have always been good at latching on to, if I may, trending politics. And Palestine was certainly a part of it, but also there is the issue of Palestine being the holy land for Christians and Muslims, of course, Jews. And so we have a situation in which some parties like the Muslim Brotherhood may have focused on that, and that could explain their rise in popularity. However, it also, perhaps as mentioned just now by the ambassador, I think that a non-state actor, there are certain lines that you're not supposed to cross. And so if you have a situation in which perhaps Muslim Brotherhood would try to have their own agenda or their own narrative, that can clash with how the state sees things. And I think this is, again, one of the reasons why we've seen the Muslim Brotherhood being censored or taken back in different states, including Jordan recently.
Thanks, Nikolai. Over to you, Steve.
Great. Well, first of all, my apologies to the ambassador for getting my B's and my T's mixed up. So definitely billions, not trillions. I don't work on the Muslim Brotherhood, so this is only knowledge I have from my friends who study the Islamist movements. But my understanding is that, one, historically, Jordan's Islamic Action Front has been a peaceful movement. And so this is a kind of a change from what it was before. But with regards to Palestine, kind of East Bank relations, my understanding is that the Islamic Action Front has actually been quite good at kind of incorporating members of both ancestral groups in Jordanian politics. And there's an argument that religious movements might be better at kind of overcoming cleavages when kind of these religious cleavages kind of overlap between other types of identity groups like ancestry.
Thanks, Steve. We have another question, and I think this topic really has appeared in two questions actually. So we'll just take these two as one for our speakers. And the question is the relationship with Jordan's relationship with Syria. And perhaps I think Nikolai might take this one. And what are the prospects of Jordan's relationship with Damascus? That's number one. And for Steve, we have another question. I think it's more on resources and economics, and it's on critical resources like water and energy, and how Jordan is navigating its policies in terms of managing these resources. So let's start with Nikolai first.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, thank you. Regarding Jordan-Syria relations, I think that Jordan has tried to maintain good relations with Syria previously. One of the reasons for that was to try to increase cooperation between the Syria-Jordan border. There was a period under the Assad regime where there was smuggling of Captagon, which is a methamphetamine drug. With the new change in government, I think that Jordan is also trying to see, what will the new government do? What stability will there be? But there is certainly hope that there will be enough stability for major cooperation. I think that, firstly, the border crossing. I can't remember if it's been opened yet, but I think that there was talk of wanting to reopen the border crossing to resume trade. And certainly also there have been some signs that the new government has wanted to clamp down on Captagon smuggling and manufacturing, which was a huge issue in Syria and, of course, affecting Jordan as well. So I think that they wish to focus on continuing that cooperation and ensuring that Captagon does not come into Jordan. There have been a few operations where Captagon has been stopped or caught, smugglers have been caught trying to bring it into the country. I think that's one of the short to medium term goals with a new government. In addition to that, perhaps in the long run, whether Syrian refugees feel safe enough to return to Syria, as there are, I think, a certain number of them in Jordan, and just having, again, going back to having positive relations, inshallah, as they say. I mean, there was a period before the war when I think trade between Syria and Jordan was good. There was cross-border tourism as well. A lot of Jordanians used to go to Damascus. It's certainly seen as quite a cultural place. So I think that's another long-term focus.
Thank you, Nikolai. Over to you, Steve, on critical resources.
Great question. In terms of energy and water use, Jordan is one of the driest countries in the world, especially in the wake of the Gaza war. What was controversial is Jordan imports or has a water agreement with Israel that was put on pause right after October 7th. I think it's been renewed recently, but it's a very politically sensitive issue, understandably, in Jordan, because the Jordanian regime is stuck between, on the one hand, having this critical water dependency, but also having to depend on a country whose policies it strongly disagrees with regards to Palestine. Jordan does not produce oil. It has been successful in renewables or alternative energies. So I just Googled this, but roughly 10% of Jordan's energy production is renewable energy. It's particularly with solar and wind in the more peripheral regions. But with regards to energy consumption, it's still a major oil importer, and it's a major importer of both water and even natural gas from Israel as well, which complicates its geopolitics.
Thanks, Steve. We have another question, I think, on, of course, I think, how could US-China competition not come up in this discussion as well? But it's from my colleague Lin Jing, whose question is, given Jordan's heavy reliance on US market access through various arrangements, including the qualifying industrial zones, and also the uncertainty of US tariff policies that we looked at earlier, could Jordan shift more of its trade towards China? And I don't know, would either one of you want to take that question, or both? I see smiles. Nikolai, do you want to go first?
Thank you. I'm not sure if I can give an extensive answer. I'm smiling because I think that there's a lot of questions about the rise of China and trade with China. We certainly see the Gulf doing good business with China, and Jordan, of course, receives aid from the Gulf. So the issue of doing trade with China, I think that Jordan will always consider diversifying its partners, but doing so within the context of also balancing relations with key aid partners, especially the United States. So that makes me say, turning to China, it is a possibility to a point, but I think that they would also consider how the United States would react because it is a major aid partner.
Thanks, Nikolai. Steve, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes. It would be important to consider what Jordan would export to China. So Jordan has an easier time exporting textiles to US markets, which is a more high-income country. I imagine they would have a harder time exporting textiles into the Chinese market. That said, in certain areas, sort of high-end technology, pharmaceuticals, maybe there could be an opportunity for Jordanian exports to tap into Chinese markets. A lesson behind these changes with the Trump administration is that countries shouldn't be, or it'd be wise for countries to not be as reliant on specific markets. This is a lesson you hear about in Singapore as well, that you want to diversify your export markets. And my impression is that in the wake, even if this Trump tariff war doesn't happen, a lesson from it is to not put all your eggs in a certain market, and then to try to diversify and create different links to different markets and try to adjust as a result of that. So I do envision there'll be more interest and more efforts for the Jordanian government and Jordanian business to try to look east, whether or not China or India or even Southeast Asia.
Sure, Steve. And since we are on the topic of geoeconomics, I think we will take one more question from the floor on this. And this is a broader question that pertains to the wider Arab world and its engagement with the US. And the question is really about whether this increasing engagement from the Arab world with the US, we are seeing Donald Trump's visit to the Gulf happening right now, and whether the engagement with the US from the Arab world would mitigate some of the negative fallouts of the tariff policy that we've been talking about. Maybe we'll switch sequence here and we'll start with Steve on his thoughts on this.
It really depends on how we define engagement with the Arab states, right? So if we're defining engagement in terms of buying or accepting 747s, then that might improve at an elite level or at a business or a state person-to-person level at the apex of power. That's going to improve relations. But I don't think those types of engagements are going to improve the livelihoods of the people in the region. I think it's much more, if we're interested in improving the livelihoods of people residing within the Arab world, then the type of engagements that would improve that would be to continue supporting outlets like US aid or continue promoting trade between the two places. My worry, and this came up with the Riviera comments, was that there's a concern that a lot of these arrangements are personally driven, that the Trump administration has personal ties, and that these ties will enrich the Trump administration and not necessarily all the broader American public. And my worry is that these arrangements would enrich certain segments of the Arab world, but not the broader Arab public. And for long-term US interests, it's much better to have a prosperous Arab world as a collective and not a much more prosperous Arab elite without the broader population.
Thanks, Steve. Over to you, Nikolai.
I agree with Steve's comments here, but I also think that the issue of the tariffs between Trump and China became quite a public one. We're now seeing whether or not that might backtrack. And I do think that for Trump, he is running an administration where there seems to be a focus on his personal relations with different leaders. And let's not forget, as mentioned, he had good relations with some of the Gulf leaders during his first term, especially Mohammed bin Salman. And I think that perhaps during this period when there has been a focus on the tariffs and has been a focus on how disastrous they may be for the US economy, he's now turning to the Gulf states to sort of shore up his image as well and to focus on trying to get their investments in the US economy. Will that offset the tariffs? I don't think it totally will, but it's also about how he wants to present himself, that the tariffs may not have worked out the way he wanted them to, and therefore he turns to allies in the Gulf states and has key visits to make that sort of the main focus of diplomacy for now.
Thank you, Nikolai. Since there was mention from both your responses regarding the geopolitics of it all, I wanted to come back, and also this ties in with one of the questions that we have from the floor over Jordan's strict policy against accepting Palestinian refugees to its own population. And maybe both of you could give some context to that and how this led to the ongoing firm stance that Jordan refuses to take in more Palestinians into its own population. I think perhaps we'll start with Nikolai this time around.
Thank you. I think that this has come up several times, not just with Palestinians, but also refugees in general, that Jordan, given its location, given the conflict it's seen in its neighborhood, I think that the king and others would say, well, should we take in the majority of refugees? What does that mean for our own population and the strain on our economy? I think that's the first one. In terms of integration, I mean, one of the problems and one of the pressures faced is, should Jordan integrate Palestinian refugees? Not just, that's not just an issue in terms of population pressure, but also the Jordan is Palestine argument used by some actors, I think, would then come into play. And this is a red line for Jordanians and for Palestinians as well. So if Jordan were to integrate further Palestinian refugees, there will be certain allies who would say, well, Jordan is Palestine, so therefore, what's the problem? That, I think, continues to be a red political line. And so we have a situation in which Jordan does not want to do that. And I think that King Abdullah again makes it clear that taking in further refugees is going to become a burden, but also if Jordan takes in more refugees, and Egypt as well, what does that mean for their population? What does it mean for the so-called Riviera plan? I think part of this is also trying to counter or block the risk of Trump's plan as well, which I think was not very popular with the Arab.
Thanks, Nikolai. Over to you, Steve.
There is definitely an identity component to this question. There's also a material or resource-based component to this objection as well. Jordan had some of the highest refugee per capita population after the Arab Spring and with the Syrian civil war, which was a tremendous strain on Jordanian resources. As discussed earlier, Jordan has very low levels of water and natural resources. So I think there's also strong material arguments against trying to accept, from the Jordanian perspective, for accepting and kind of assimilating more refugees from Gaza. It's important to note that Jordan is, I think, the only state to have extended citizenship to Palestinian refugees in the 1950s, I believe. That unlike places like Syria or Lebanon to this day, where you have generations of refugees, excluding the Palestinians who still live in refugee camps in Jordan, many Jordanians of Palestinian descent were granted citizenship at the time. So I also think that's part of a fabric of this question, which also complicates the identity politics issue of integrating and assimilating Gazans into Jordan.
Thanks both. I think I would like to wrap things up with one more big question on geopolitics, and that pertains to the region. And we all well know that the US president is visiting the region now. And both of you briefly touched on the Trump administration 2.0 and what it means for Jordan. My question would be, to conclude this discussion, would be, part one, how has Jordan's approach, if it has changed so far, approach to the Trump administration differed than when it was during the Biden administration? That's number one. And part two, how do you see King Abdullah II managing Mr. Trump going forward for the rest of his term? I think, of course, these probably no one has an idea of the future, but I wanted to hear what your thoughts are on these two questions. Let's start with perhaps Steve this time around.
I am nervous answering this question because I haven't been following that much King Abdullah's relations with Biden versus King Abdullah's relations with Trump. But as an academic, I'll do this anyways. My read was that, at least publicly, the relationship between Abdullah and Biden was much more contentious. In the wake of the Gaza war, I think King Abdullah was much more upset, publicly upset with Biden as well. He hasn't, in comparison with Trump, my sense is that King Abdullah has been much more muted, more diplomatic, less kind of flashy in terms of his relations with the US president. And my understanding, at least in the short term, this seems to be playing off, that you don't want to pull a Zelensky when meeting with Trump. I like Nikolai's point of trying to make compromises, not embarrassing, not trying to one-up someone. That seems to have worked well for the Hashemite, for King Abdullah. And in many ways, Trump and King Abdullah have similarities, or geopolitical congruence, right? So neither are particularly interested in, I would say, in deeper democratization, or at least the United States promoting democratization or promoting LGBT rights or promoting greater press freedoms within Jordan. So I think that narrative or that pillar of U.S. foreign policy has been muted with regards to the region. And I think King Abdullah appreciates that. And that's not something he's going to spar with Trump as opposed to with Biden, where this issue is more complicated.
Thanks, Steve. Nikolai, you have the final word.
Thank you. Yes, I think there are a couple of points here regarding Biden. So let's not forget that the so-called war in Gaza happened, I think, before Trump began his second term. So we could also see that things could have been contentious during this time, as King would have probably been asking himself, okay, so how is this going to affect the region, the issue of refugees that would start to come up as well. The other thing is, going back to Steve's point about being diplomatic with Trump, I think that what we saw with Zelensky is really, was an undiplomatic spat. It was very, very public. And I think that part of this perhaps is recognizing that each president has a different management style, and you have to learn how to work with that flow. Perhaps with Trump's unique management style, King Abdullah and others would be more discreet, and that's why we haven't seen a spat. I don't feel that the region is necessarily happy with everything Trump is doing. There are some who even argue that the so-called Riviera plan was intentionally meant to be one that Arab states would not be happy with, to get them back to the discussion table, so that they would accept something else. But I think that for now, we're seeing Abdullah probably trying to just manage what's happening in his region. And again, being the recipient of U.S. aid, this would mean that he wants to be careful with relations to Trump as well, and keep things as diplomatic as possible.
Thank you, Nikolai, for your answers. So we've come to the end of today's discussion, and I would like to thank both our speakers, Steve and Nikolai, for your presentations, your remarks, and also taking the time to answer a very lively audience and their questions, and also thanking our MEI team for putting this together, putting the virtual panel together, and allowing our speakers to share their thoughts on today's topic, which is on Jordan. A very difficult question, I think, pertaining to both domestic politics and geopolitics, but I think we had excellent discussion. So thank you both again, and we hope to have you on in our future events. And thank you to our audience as well. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much. Take care.